I'm Frank von Hippel. I'm from Princeton University, the program on science and global security. Can you hear me? Okay, yeah. And I'm chairing this first session, which is on how to revive arms control and disarmament. It does need revival. It had its glory days during the Gorbachev years, and thereafter during the Yeltsin period as well. Thanks to Gorbachev, and thanks to the citizen uprising in the United States and Canada and in Europe against the nuclear arms race. As a result of that, we downsized the number of nuclear weapons by a factor of 10. But then we thought that the problem was done, and activists moved on to other issues, including climate change, and the military-industrial complex moved back in, and we lost that momentum, and in fact now it's in danger of being reversed. In the Clinton years, the mantra became, it's the economy, stupid, and we're still there. President Obama came in and got a Nobel Peace Prize for advocating total nuclear disarmament, but he was able, because of the lack of the loss of public interest, he was able to only achieve one treaty, the New START Treaty, which reduced strategic weapons by about 15%. But he had to do that at a price of committing to a whole new generation of nuclear weapons and nuclear weapons delivery vehicles that, one estimate is $1.7 trillion. That is just getting underway, that huge investment in nuclear weaponry, which is supposed to be good until 2080, which is very different from the goal President Obama had. We obviously need to start turning the momentum in another direction, and that's the purpose of the subject of discussion of the panel. The first speaker will be Cesar Jaramillo, who you know well as the chair of Canadian Pugwash and also the director of Project Plowshares of the Canadian Council of Churches. And the second speaker will be Matt Korda, who is I just learned is a Canadian, although he's currently resident in Washington. And he's the deputy director of the Nuclear Notebook Project of the Federation of American Scientists, which is published by the Board of Atomic Scientists and also by the Stockholm Institute of Peace Research. And is really the authoritative source of information on the nuclear arsenals globally. So I'll turn it over now to Cesar.
We're switching it up.
Okay, turn it over to Matt.
Oh, amazing. Right. All right. Can everyone hear me? Yeah, it's good. Amazing. Even more? How's that? Better? Okay. Great. Wonderful. Well, thank you so much to everyone for being here. Thank you so much to the University of Ottawa, to Project Plowshares, to all of you for being here. As Frank mentioned, I live in Washington, D.C. these days, but I'm from Toronto. I'm Canadian originally, and so it's really, 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 really nice to be back amid friends, and to be in the Canadian disarmament space, because it's very different and in many ways much more dynamic sometimes than the American one. So it's exciting to be here. So I'm gonna try and make these slides work. Let's see if this works. Amazing. Okay, so as Frank mentioned, our major research output at the Federation of American Scientists is to produce the best non-classified estimates of global nuclear arsenals and trends. And we do that using open sources, right? So things like satellite imagery in particular, but also Freedom of Information Act requests, budgetary information, treaty data, leaks, really anything that we can sort of get our hands on to try and package that information into I guess, a useful set of data and distribute it to folks who can use it, right? So folks like yourselves, academics, activists, policymakers, interested members of the public, really anyone who can use that data to advocate for smarter nuclear policies, to advocate for nuclear risk reduction, nuclear disarmament, really anything like that. So that type of work, I think, is getting more important, right? Because as the nuclear stockpiles are going up and nuclear risks are going up, so is nuclear opacity, right? Countries are increasingly less interested in talking about their nuclear weapons, right? They are more interested in building up in secret, right? I sort of say that as a general statement across the board, right? This is happening basically in every single nuclear armed country. Transparency is going down across the board. And so we need open sources to be able to understand collectively what is going on in the world of nuclear weapons. So I've been asked to offer my thoughts about the new nuclear age in which we find ourselves, which I think is characterized by two different kinds of instability, right? And sorry, this is a map of our products. So, but two different kinds of instability, right? Arms race instability and crisis instability. The former is driving nuclear armed states to build up their arsenals, and the latter is making nuclear use more likely when tensions are high, right? These two types of instability, I would say, I think most folks would agree, are at their highest point since the end of the Cold War. And so understanding why that is the case will help us sort of guide our discussion today as we talk about how to reduce those risks, right? So first, let's talk about arms race instability, right? All 9 nuclear armed states are in the midst of extensive and expensive modernization campaigns. And by modernization, I mean they are essentially replacing every single delivery system and warhead in their nuclear arsenals with newer versions, right? And some are increasing the sizes of their arsenals, some are increasing the quality or efficiency of their warheads, some are doing both, right? And these modernization campaigns are being driven by this sort of collective embrace of what is going around as the new sort of term du jour as great power competition, right? In DC, probably every like 5 years or so, collectively, the like wonk class comes up with a new term to describe the geostrategic environment. We're now in great power competition. I'm sure we'll find a new one soon. But really, the sort of the crux of this is that what we're experiencing is this sort of action-reaction security dynamic that's going on between several nuclear-armed countries, most notably here the United States, Russia, and China, but also really amongst sort of all of the 9 nuclear-armed states. And what do I mean by action-reaction? Right, one illustration of this is the relationship between countries building defensive systems and then countries building offensive systems to circumvent those defenses. So in March 2018, for example, President Putin made headlines around the world. He announced these sort of new, what the media called exotic new weapon systems. And they were sort of wacky, right? Some of them were a little weird, right? One was I think a nuclear powered cruise missile. One was this sort of underwater tsunami yielding missile. But what's important about that is that 5 out of those 6 systems were specifically intended to evade US missile defenses or play a supporting role in other systems' evasive maneuvers, right? And so we're sort of seeing this across the board, right? Whereas countries sort of used to say that missile defenses were oriented just towards what they would call rogue states, right? So sort of third-party threats, right, like North Korea or Iran, and not against nuclear peers in the hope that it would sort of make these countries less likely to build up against each other. Now we are sort of, all of these lines are being blurred, right? We're seeing in the United States, but also in other countries, people are talking about missile defenses as basically being targeted against any adversary, right? And so when that sort of happens, what we end up with is countries trying to build themselves out of that gap, right? And offense is always going to be cheaper than defense. And so no matter essentially how much these defensive systems proliferate and improve, they're usually able to be sort of circumvented against. And it's why we're sort of seeing these new types of quote unquote, exotic missile systems that are sort of popping up. It's important to also recognize the inherent links between quite a powerful weapons industry and nuclear policy, right? And this is, I give an example here. This is a sort of marketing tool that's used by Northrop Grumman, which is the big company that is building the new US intercontinental ballistic missile. But really, what the important part about this graphic is that what they try and illustrate, and this is what they do in their sort of approaches to Congress, is to demonstrate how basically this new ICBM is going to affect constituents in every single state in the United States, right? This happens not just with the ICBM, not just with Northrop Grumman, but really with every single sort of piece of nuclear policy. It affects everyone in the United States. And as a result, it's quite difficult to sort of fight back against those programs. This is also the case in Russia and in many other countries, right? This isn't just a US example. And so what happens is that, we'll see quite a bit of mirror imaging, right? These industry links tend to promote mirror imaging between countries, right? Where we will see one country that builds a system, and then another country will say, okay, well, that country has built a system, now we need that exact same system, even though it doesn't necessarily work for their nuclear or military doctrines, right? So for example, about 10 countries, including 7 of the 9 nuclear-armed states, are known to have hypersonic technology demonstrator programs, right? The media and political hype that has sort of gone into those programs talking about highly maneuverable missiles is contributing to the arms race in some way, right? Because politicians are continuously advocating for the need to sort of mirror image, right? They say China and Russia are building these, the United States has to build them as well, but they don't necessarily make sense in every country's nuclear doctrine, right? You need those missiles to perform a very specific military task, and sometimes your doctrine doesn't match that, but they're being built anyways, right? And so for some countries, it sort of seems like the weapons are being built first, and then the questions about how and when to use them are being asked second, right? Which is usually not the way you want policy to go. These new programs are also able to be pursued because for the first time in more than 50 years, we are today effectively living in an era of no more great power arms control. And New START, which is the last bilateral arms control treaty between the United States and Russia, it technically remains in effect until 2026, but it is de facto not functioning, right? Neither the United States nor Russia is currently complying with the treaty. And this is a really serious problem for mitigating the arms race because both the US and Russia have meticulously planned their force sizes under the assumption that neither is going to exceed the limits of the treaty, right? And so when neither side is complying anymore, you sort of default to these worst case assumptions about what the other country is going to do. And you can see this in this great quote here, or this unfortunate quote from the chairman of the House Armed Services Committee, where Mike Rogers says, the Joint Staff needs to assume that Russia has or will be breaching the New START caps, even though the State Department and other functions within the US government have said, we don't think Russia is breaching those caps. But we're sort of starting to see this political hype and rhetoric around the fact that, well, we might as well assume the worst case scenario. And so that's how we have to resize our force in response. Without working treaties, legal limits, or a mutual agreement to cap their forces, both the US and Russia could effectively double their deployed nuclear arsenals, perhaps in a year or two, right? Some of this involves just pulling old warheads out of storage and sort of redeploying them or re-uploading them on existing missiles. But the important thing is that those new uploads could be done without building a single new system, right? It is entirely just taking warheads out of storage and putting them on deployed missiles, right? The important thing here too is that the rush to rebuild would be really visible, right? We would be able to see that on satellite imagery, right? And if we can see it in the open source, certainly countries will be able to see it behind closed doors as well. And so the pressure is on both sides to be able to build up quickly, but also simultaneously try to convince the other that they're not out to seek superiority, right? That's going to be a really, really difficult tension to balance. And so that could raise real risks of potential preemption or in a time of crisis or conflict where tensions are quite high. So this is I guess a good segue into the second form of instability that's a central feature of this new nuclear age, which is crisis instability, right? Crisis instability is present when, during a nuclear crisis, one or both countries perceive that it's in their interest to launch nuclear weapons first, right? This is not sort of a good place to be, but it's where we are finding ourselves increasingly in a lot of different nuclear hotspots around the globe, right? So we can take India and Pakistan as a great example here, right? Not only are both countries increasing their nuclear arsenals, but what's particularly concerning is that both countries are placing a premium on being able to launch extremely quickly in a crisis, right? So we're seeing India unveiling these new systems over the past year that involve missiles being launched from canisters, which means that you can essentially roll them out, launch them very quickly. And then also in recent years, Pakistan has emphasized the ability to launch extremely short-range, low-yield nuclear weapons at the outset of a crisis, with the idea that it would potentially offset India's conventional superiority, right? So here we're sort of creeping towards the situation where both countries are finding it in their interests to be the first ones to launch in a crisis. And I guess a real challenge with that is that sometimes accidents happen, right? Sometimes miscalculations happen. And one example that I think kind of went under the radar was something that happened 2 years ago when India accidentally launched a cruise missile into Pakistani territory, right? And it landed on the ground. Thankfully, no one was hurt. But you can imagine, right, a situation where if those countries already are in a state of heightened tensions, perhaps in a state of conflict, right, that sort of situation spirals out of control really, really quickly. The potential for nuclear escalation, I think, also gets even a little bit spicier when you factor in the growing phenomenon that nuclear armed states are increasingly entangling both their civilian and military infrastructures together, as well as their nuclear and non-nuclear infrastructures together, right? So for example, satellites orbiting the Earth, right, can provide an essential function for nuclear command, control, and communication, but they can also be used for non-nuclear, civilian-related, civilian purposes, right? They can also be used for reconnaissance. They can be used to maintain satellites, right? So there are so many different functions that are all being sort of put together into one technology. And during a conventional conflict, you can imagine that it might be in one country's interest to target another country's space assets. But how would that country know that that isn't a prelude to a nuclear armed attack, right? When it comes to worst case thinking, it's also impossible to sort of disentangle the psychological and emotional states of nuclear armed leaders and from nuclear politics, right? Given that in many countries, it is the power to launch nuclear weapons is imbued on a single individual. And so, this essentially means that the psychological states of nuclear armed leaders do dictate nuclear weapons policy in many countries. And, each of these 9 nuclear armed leaders have to get nuclear decisions correct every single time in order to avoid nuclear weapons use. And, deterrence theory has sort of traditionally assumed that leaders are going to be rational and act in a way that is predictable and that we can expect. Is that still the case? I've put up some photos of leaders here. I let everyone form their own opinions about whether or not we think these folks are completely rational. But we've certainly seen that in the past years, leaders have been willing to use the manipulation of nuclear risk as a form of statecraft, right? Which is to some extent a new feature of this age, right? Can we trust that these same leaders aren't going to make decisions based on pure emotion or instinct? Can we trust that these leaders are not surrounded by information management systems and yes men and people who tell them what they want to hear when it comes to nuclear related decisions? Personally, I'm skeptical of that. So with all that context in mind, what can countries do? Oh, actually, sorry, I'll touch on one more thing as well. So we also have a lack of trusted crisis communication mechanisms, right? So during the Cold War, there was, a series of hotlines, things like that between sort of these high-level leaders, right? The United States and the Soviet Union. These were effective at the sort of the presidential head of state level, to some extent effective at the military to military level. There are some hotlines that still exist, but not all nuclear armed states are linked up together, right? It is, and I think in a world in which basically it is impossible to imagine a nuclear conflict today that isn't going to pull in multiple countries, right? Then it seems unfathomable that we don't have these crisis communication mechanisms to be able to allow Russia, China, and the United States to talk to each other all at the same time, right? Or the P5, right? The countries, the permanent members of the UN Security Council, to all talk together about their nuclear weapons arsenals. So with that context in mind, what can we do to reduce nuclear risks in the new nuclear age, right? Well, they need to mitigate the drivers of these two different types of instability, right? So to address arms control instability, it's critical that the US and its allies, and really every country, dedicates time and resources to understanding and empathizing, which is something we talked about yesterday, with the security concerns of its future arms control partners, is what I would like to call them. I think typically in DC, we hear like adversaries, competitors. I think these are all future arms control partners, right? If we sort of put a more positive spin on it, the US, Russia, and China. And chief among these concerns, I think we sort of talked about this, but is the development of advanced defensive systems, and particularly sort of these perception that these defensive systems are able to be sort of directed at anyone, right? And that this is kind of an open-ended project, right? Countries have sort of long been wary of sort of the open-endedness and the sort of ever-expanding architecture of missile defenses, right? And it always creates an incentive to sort of build around them, right? So what if we sort of were willing to put those limits on the table, not even necessarily suggest, you know, we have to reduce anything, but just put a limit, a future limit, right? And then see kind of where that takes us. I guess in order to do this, right, states are going to have to sit down at the table, right, with one another. The United States and Russia have about a half century of experience on this, but that has sort of fallen away recently. China does not have much experience on this, right? This is a relatively new sort of engagement on the arms control side, which I think is welcome, but needs to sort of be continuously encouraged. But I think a challenge here is going to be able to compartmentalize arms control and nuclear policy issues from all of these other security dynamics that are happening in the world, right? We're seeing that the United States and Russia don't want to sit down at a table together because of the Ukraine issue, right? That's going to be a big sticking point. But during the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union were able to sit down at the table despite ideological differences, despite other conflicts that were going on. So how do we sort of get arms control back into a more compartmentalized framework, recognize that we need to limit nuclear arsenals regardless of what's going on in the rest of the world, and then sort of work from there? When it comes to sort of addressing, I guess, crisis instability, I would suggest that nuclear-armed countries should also consider establishing some kind of checks and balances into nuclear launch authority, right, in a crisis. The current system, which is a lot of it is built on the Cold War, it is meant to empower leaders to be able to launch extremely quickly in a crisis, right? The idea being that you want to be able to preserve your nuclear arsenal in the event that another country attacks you first, right? But the challenge is that given that these leaders can be subject to a variety of, I guess I'll call them like distortions, right? For lack of a better term, they can either be psychological or emotional distortions or just a lack of information, right? Accidents, miscalculations, miscommunications. It's, I think, pretty critical for global security that there be sort of this extra step inserted into the launch processes of some of these nuclear armed states. And I guess, you know, back to this crisis communications point, clearly, you know, it's imperative that these countries who are not talking to each other on a regular basis are able to talk to each other in the context of crises, right? So to go back to that India and Pakistan example, when that missile was accidentally launched, what was really notable about that was that India did not make a public statement for 2 days, right? And Pakistan, apparently, according to news reports, put some of its frontline bases on alert, you know, attempted to sort of contact Indian officials and got nothing, right? So what we're hearing from that is that countries with nuclear weapons do not talk to each other as often as they should, right? So how do we improve those mechanisms to be able to allow them to talk to each other, especially during a crisis when it's most needed? And so I guess if I were to sort of end on a positive note, you know, we are going to hear, I guess, a lot today about nuclear risks and how the risks are growing. But what's clear, and I think especially from what's clear from just sort of looking out at this room, is that there's a tremendous amount of public interest in nuclear risks, right? The idea that nuclear weapons are this thing of the past is clearly not relevant anymore, right? This is an incredibly new field. It's an exciting field to work in, perhaps not for like a great reason, but I think it is, you know, it is a field that's growing and there's a lot of interest in it. And clearly there are a lot of new sort of cultural artifacts that are starting to make their way into the public imagination, right? Things like Oppenheimer, Fallout, right? New books about nuclear weapons that are hitting the bestseller list. And I think that's a really positive thing, right? And so I guess I'll close there, but yeah, really looking forward to the discussion. And thanks very much.
Matt, and turning it over to Cesar.
Thank you, Matt. That was excellent and fascinating. Thank you so much for that. Very sobering as well. And in terms of, you know, if you were trying to scare us a little bit about instability, but we are in a very unstable time, and we are in the midst of great power competition, whatever we call this period. You know, what's in the name? We are in the midst of very active great power competition, which will only increase. I think that's predictable enough in its intensity, in its methods, in its materialization. You know, we will see a lot more evidence of this big power competition. So nuclear nightmares. There's, you know, various dimensions to this, unfortunately. So the first thing I will say is that it's probably important to differentiate, at least in my mind, the immediate nuclear nightmare stemming out of Ukraine, of that whole context, and the slightly broader nuclear nightmare of our inability as an international community to really craft a credible path to nuclear disarmament, of which there is none. So, but I think, although related, these are two slightly different matters and require a slightly different policy toolset from us and from Canada and from the international community. And with the latter, you know, it's perhaps more complex, multifaceted, interrelated, multidimensional processes. With the former, with Ukraine, it's just urgent measures. And as we were discussing yesterday at this conference I referred to at the outset, it's really recognizing which conditions might realistically lead to nuclear weapons being used. And at that point, it's little consolation to know, well, this party is more to blame, or this party is more to blame, or this party is more to blame, because who cares? We're going to be dead at that point. So it's really, how do we avoid those circumstances? You know, how do we avoid those circumstances? And might be we, the collective West, however you see it, however, inadvertently contributing to creating those circumstances. And I think we need to be very mindful. And of course, we need to create very strong expectations from Russia not to do anything to create those circumstances. You know, every party needs to be careful to avoid that scenario, but once again, it's a realistic scenario, and the nature of escalation is such, you don't have to plan for nuclear escalation. You know, nobody, I mean, there's such a thing as scenarios that neither party wants, and nonetheless, we get there. So just to be extra careful about that. But I'll focus my remarks more on the problem with nuclear weapons, our inability to get rid of them, and some of the steps that could sort of, besides stepping up away from the immediate brink, just crafting a credible path to nuclear abolition. So first, there is no credible path to nuclear abolition. I mean, my friends have heard me say this before, including yesterday, that it's not that it's an imperfect path that one criticizes or adds corrective actions here and there. Is that there is no path. It's a jumble of, you know, disjointed initiatives, some most unsuccessful. There's a little incremental victories here and there. But on the whole, I think no one could say, oh, we're on the path to nuclear abolition. We may get there sooner or a little bit later, but we're heading in the exact opposite direction for reasons, among others, well described by Matt, and it's creating that sort of a stability crisis that I think is pretty undeniable. So how do we deal with that? So there's so many levels to this question, but today, and you know, I'm going to attempt some sort of bigger picture questions. So one is entrench the norm against possession. We're not there. I mean, it's very well entrenched in our minds and in this crew and in this community, but in terms of the players without whom nuclear abolition we know will not happen, you know, the norm needs to be entrenched there. And the norm, I might add, should not only cover nuclear detonations, it must be sufficiently clear that possession in itself is a problem. Possession in itself is a problem. Nuclear weapons do not become problematic the moment they are used. They're already problematic. You know, who could argue that nuclear weapons have not been used in Ukraine? We know they haven't been detonated in that context, but you know, you can be sure they're being used and they're having an impact, and they're having an effect, and they will continue to have an effect. Just the knowledge of their presence has an effect and informs policy and informs military strategy. So there is a built-in threat in the very possession of nuclear weapons, and that norm is simply not entrenched. There is not entrenched. I mean, the nuclear weapon states, I mean, with their thousands of weapons, like nothing to see here, you know, it's like nothing's happening. But that possession is highly conducive to instability, and those problems are exacerbated by the failure of lines of communications and red phones and the like, and the crumbling of the security architecture, which is another point I will make. So again, we have to entrench the norm, and the norm includes possession, the very possession. And this was a stumbling block, or this was a point of tension when the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons was coming about, is that treaty, and the nuclear weapon states have rejected it for a host of reasons, and their allies for a host of reasons. But I suspect that one of them is that with the NPT, the old 1970 treaty, you know, they being able to get away with possession, you know, indefinite possession. Whereas with the TPNW, it makes it very unambiguously clear that the very possession is not acceptable or legal. So that's one thing, entrenching them. The second point I want to draw attention to is the centrality, the crucial centrality of what we call nuclear dependent states. So when people look at the NPT regime, they imagine, generally speaking, two camps. The very few that stubbornly continue to have nuclear weapons and threaten the world with their very possession, as we have learned, and the rest of the international community that has forgone nuclear weapons and you know is pushing, you know, in unison for their abolition. It's not that. There's a third camp, you know, that is very crucial, and that is the nuclear dependent states. And Canada is firmly entrenched in that group of the nuclear dependent states. And these are states that, you know, live in a certain duality, whereby on the one hand, they come to NPT meetings and they present themselves as responsible international actors that have forgone nuclear weapons. We could have had them, but we renounced them, you know, very proudly. On the other, they overtly, and make no secret of this, support nuclear deterrence policy and the indefinite possession of nuclear weapons by military alliances that they are party to and members of, sit on the nuclear weapons planning group, and declare that nuclear weapons are their supreme security guarantee. So how do you square that circle? I mean, which is it? So there is a duality, and that tension. My point once again is the centrality of this core group. You know, so I think it will be very difficult to make progress in nuclear abolition, real progress, without the involvement. You know, we have to get the nuclear dependent states on this side. You know, they're on defense at best. On defense at best. I'm not saying their policies are identical to their nuclear weapon state allies, but they're on defense at best, and that will not cut it. You know, those states have to, just like other states, you know, that are non-nuclear weapon states are calling very forcibly for nuclear disarmament, and we need to hear that from nuclear weapon states. Because what is happening is that these states, including Canada and other, for example, members of NATO, are enabling the 5 states, possessors, you know, and there's other 4 out there, but let's refer to the P5. They're allowing them to say, listen, we don't just have these weapons for our security, we have them for theirs as well. They want us to have them. They want us to have these weapons for their security. So it's, you know, it's not just that. So I think they need to be further isolated, these states, And that is also part of entrenching this global norm. And part of that isolation is it's just very hard to make progress when we have these ambivalent states in both camps. Yes, we recognize the threat and the humanitarian imperative, but it's also our supreme security guarantee that won't cut it for nuclear abolition. So again, the centrality of nuclear dependent states is crucial. And I will say one more thing about that. I really don't know if there's a crisis of self-awareness in some of these states, but when I hear them speak often in the UN and elsewhere, I think they present themselves as supporters of nuclear disarmament, or as strong supporters of nuclear disarmament. So just there's a gap between that self-perception and the outside perception, because from the perspective of civil society, these states are obstacles to overcome on the path to nuclear disarmament. I don't think anyone in the United Nations, anecdotally or methodically, we can survey, particularly see, these non-nuclear weapon states are a member of NATO as allies on the path to nuclear disarmament. They're seen as obstacles to overcome. So once again, that includes Canada. So we have a bit of work to do there. I'm mindful of the time. The machinery, we have to pay attention to the machinery under which nuclear disarmament is happening or should happen or could happen in the future. It's a messed up machinery. There is an erosion. First of all, there is an erosion of trust and credibility in the key regimes, the key treaties, the key forums, the key venues. The Conference on Disarmament has produced, virtually nothing in decades. We used to say years, and then we say decades, in decades. FMCT, the fissile material file, is caught up there, in that limbo. The negative security assurances is caught in that limbo, and general nuclear disarmament and concerns related to outer space security, the prevention of arms race in outer space, are caught in that limbo. So, what is supposed to be the key disarmament body in the world is like dysfunctional, non-functional. So that is problematic. The NPT is losing credibility as we speak. There's a clear and palpable erosion of credibility in the NP, Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty regime. The TPNW, which I've supported and continue to support, despite its promise and best intentions, is not right now. Doesn't seem like it's going to be the one that's going to channel all the nuclear abolition efforts. So the machinery needs attention. The CCW, only tangentially related, but these are key multilateral forums and venues and institutions that are simply not working. So it's no surprise in a way that the processes that are supposed to be unfolding under those regimes and institutions are not yielding any results. So I think institutional support for that deficit is in forums and venues and the machinery, what we call the machinery, is crucial. And last, I have like 4 more, but I'll pick one. Last, seems unrelated to nuclear disarmament at first, and my colleagues heard me yesterday, conventional military spending. Oh my God, it's like off the charts, conventional military spending, and it's just not credible that nuclear disarmament, nuclear abolition can ever be reached with this trend, this pattern of conventional military spending. We noted yesterday how NATO, this incessant call for a greater proportion of GDP to be spent on defense, and how that has shifted very gradually the language around it, from a target of 2% to at least 2% to now we're hearing chatter of 3%, very gradual. How are those military disparities going to be addressed on the path to nuclear disarmament? And this speaks to a broader question of, Robin, I'm looking at you, Peggy, of common security, alternative security arrangements that are going to be necessary because nuclear weapons, will produce a certain void. So that has to be addressed. And nuclear weapons are, a rough equalizer. The India could easily defeat Pakistan with conventional military, but you boom, enter nuclear weapons, they're rough equals. Okay, and then the states will always feel that temptation. And as long as there are those pressures stemming from conventional military spending, there will be, I think, comparable pressures to for not everybody, some states to have have a nuclear arsenal. So that is problematic, and that needs to be addressed. More than $2.4 trillion were spent last year on conventional weapons. So that's, of course, going to have an impact. Taken together, just to wrap up, together, I think there are things that need to happen at a high normative level so that nuclear abolition becomes a priority. And by the way, part of it seeming like a priority is to be spoken. You know, I can't remember if our prime minister has uttered the words nuclear disarmament. Maybe I could be wrong. I really don't know. Obama mentioned them in Prague, and he got the Nobel Peace Prize the next year. And so, I mean, imagine the impact of, you know, at that level of just talking about nuclear abolition, you know, it has a high impact. So normative level, the machinery, you know, the mechanics of it demand attention, and the related issues related to security that, even though they're not part of the nuclear weapons infrastructure directly, but have a bearing on it that we'd be wise to recognize early, also require a bit of attention. Thank you very much.
Two excellent talks. We have about a little over 10 minutes for questions, comments. So please. There's a microphone. Yeah.
First and foremost, kudos to SIPS and the Plowshare, and also our colleague Paul, who was responsible for this. My name is Hamid Georgiani, and I have a question which would be directed at Matt. You raised a very good point, and that was information management. And when we look at some of the points that were raised, it seems it comes back to that issue, which means there are processes that would advise someone like Mr. Trump to come out of a JCPOA. Or during the Cold War, it was a group of people who were dominating all the politics and all the discussions regarding disarmament. I was wondering if you could elaborate on that within the context that we are in right now. Thank you.
Both of you can.
Yeah, sure. Hello. Great. Thank you for the question. It's a great question. Yeah, I think, you know, one significant challenge, which I spoke about, which is the need to ensure that the information flows that are getting to the people who make nuclear decisions are filled with accurate and correct information. Thanks. And what we've seen is that there's actually been some really interesting research that's been done over the past few years that is basically simulating how leaders are able to make decisions with regards to nuclear weapons. So there was a project that took place at Princeton, actually, where virtual reality was used to essentially simulate a president having to make decisions about nuclear launch authority. And you got to essentially play this game, right, where you were the president and you got to ask questions and you would receive inputs, and you would, you know, there would be these sort of fake Stratcom people yelling at you and saying, you know, we've received alerts that a certain number of ICBMs are headed your way and you have to make a decision about what to do. And what the point of this, I don't want to call it a game, what the point of this simulation was twofold, right? One is to sort of demonstrate to people that a nuclear crisis can be extremely dangerous, right? And so a part of it was an educational tool. But the second part, which is, I think, almost more interesting, was to try and understand what would a normal person do in that situation, right? Because luckily we don't have a strong data set for what people are going to do during nuclear crises, because there haven't been that many, which is good. But so what essentially this research found is that all of the inputs, right, that a president or a decision maker receives are pushing you towards a nuclear launch, right? They inherently bias you because that is the system that we've set up, right? The system that we've set up since the time of the Cold War is to be able to launch extremely quickly in a crisis and to essentially not ask questions, right? To be able to push the button very, very quickly. And so when, I guess, going back to your question, when we think about information management and sort of putting in these checks and balances about, trying to ensure that leaders don't have just this overwhelming push to launch very quickly in a crisis, we have to think about, what different kinds of information can we give to them? How can that information be presented, right? When a president opens up the briefcase and has their menu of nuclear options, right? It actually is very important how those options are presented, right? What are the colors that are being used, right? What are the different charts that they are being shown? Because they're not being shown like a 20-page document. They are being shown a small card that says, here's a pie chart that shows here's how much of your nuclear force will go away if you launch, and here is how much of their nuclear force will go away if you launch, and you just have to make decisions based on that, right? And that is not a great way to ensure that a president has access to good information, right? So I think it really comes down to sort of rethinking this architecture for launching and for making decisions about nuclear weapons and how that information is presented to people. I hope that sort of answers your question, but I guess that's a series of anecdotes to try and illustrate a few things.
Would add that making the decision not to launch is the most. Cesar, did you have?
No, I was just learning
Okay.
from Matt here.
Back there? No, that's you. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you. First off, thank you so much to both panelists. It was a really interesting panel, and I definitely learned a lot. My name is Nathan Harlan. I'm a student from Carleton University, and I was wondering specifically about the case of how you negotiate nuclear disarmament with a state with a limited nuclear stockpile. For instance, with Russia and China, they have, Russia and the United States, rather, they have essentially parity with each other. Their ability to ensure mutually assured destruction is roughly equal. But with states like China, they have fewer nuclear weapons, and they're working on expanding that arsenal because they believe they need to achieve parity with the United States. And nuclear weapons are also seen as one of the markers of a great power. If you have nuclear weapons, they, equal to other great powers, you're more or less on the same level. So how would you make an arms control regime where how would you negotiate it where you could make it in China's best interest to reduce their nuclear stockpile when they believe that they would see this as a one-sided negotiation?
Sure. Thank you, Nathan. Wonderful question. Very, very good question. So a few things to comment in that regard. I mean, first, as I said earlier, I mean, there is no concrete plan. So there's possibilities of how that might play out. But a few pointers. One, historically, I think that remains true today. There's the assumption that the U.S. and Russia in particular bear a special responsibility just because of the sheer numbers of nuclear weapons that they have. But I don't think it's been that effectively articulated what that special responsibility means. I mean, some people that I've spoken to interpret it as, they have to start because they're in the thousands and most others are in the hundreds, and perhaps others join when everybody's in the hundreds. But the need to engage China in that level of strategic discussion, I think, is becoming increasingly clear. Even between Russia and the United States, it seems, New START, the remaining sort of agreement between these two major superpowers, it's looking increasingly difficult that it will continue for many years. That it will be renewed. So it's difficult. But parallel to that crumbling, I've heard voices that for sure already it is time to start creating spaces for China to be part of that conversation, and that it doesn't make sense for China to be excluded. And I've also heard mutual accusations. One that that we haven't been invited, or they haven't accepted the invitation to join the table, and there's a bit of misinformation there as to why really at the end of the day China is not there. My view is China needs to be there. I think these strategic conversations and even the crumbling of U.S.-Russia strategic mechanisms for dialogue, let's call them that, New START or other measures, that needs to be revived. And I think in the context of that revival, that creates an opportunity to bring China into the mix. And the last point is the last few 100 nuclear weapons like in the world, if we get there, will be the toughest. I think there's a sort of a more than 2 stages, but if we leave it to 2, you know, there's a part of getting to the hundreds, and then there's a very difficult simultaneity of getting rid of all of those when most states say and continue to say, as long as nuclear weapons exist, we will have them. So then that will, you know, present some tricky challenges.
Just to,
I might add that once you have 100, it doesn't matter. You basically have the ability to destroy civilization. One last question. I'm afraid we only have time for one more. Oh,
I might add just a really quick 30 seconds and then we'll get to the last question. Just because it's a really great question. And you raise a really good point about the asymmetry between different types of countries and different stockpiles. So I think that the response to that is maybe arms control has to get a little more creative, right? Get a little bit outside the box. Maybe an arms control agreement itself has to be asymmetric, right? Maybe it doesn't necessarily mean that the countries will agree to the same types of limits, right? Perhaps it means that, okay, well, we take, you know, China is very concerned about what is going on in space, right? And the United States is very concerned about, you know, what China's doing in, you know, lots of other different ways, right? So maybe there are ways that you sort of balance those things a little differently that don't necessarily revolve around parity, right? So these questions about sort of an asymmetric arms control agreement, I think are worth exploring. Just wanted to throw that out there.
we have time for one more?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for this presentation. Thank you very much for this presentation. I'm Richard Denton. I'm with IPP&W, International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War, and also with Rotary. I would make the statement that nuclear weapons are obsolete. They have not been used for 79 years. There's been attempts to use them on at least 5 different occasions, which were turned down at various occasions. We are now seeing in actuality on the battlefield AI, the drones. You can have a $3,000 drone take out a $12 million tank. The Soviets have moved their fleet from Odessa to Sebastopol because they were being attacked by drones. And so the reality is that we just haven't used nuclear weapons, and that Israel is showing that they can take out key players very effectively through AI and drones. So the proposition is that nuclear weapons are obsolete. Comments?
Not sure comments are necessary. Maybe I'll just give it back to the coffee time. Pardon? Okay, you want to comment?
Sure. Thank you, Richard. I partially agree with you. I mean, but the point is very well taken. But yeah, they should be obsolete for sure. But I mean, I watch with great worry that their relevance seems to be growing for some players. And just to keep it brief, and the other point is that, as I said when in one of my remarks, that they're already, from a certain perspective, they are being used. I mean, so their obsolescence needs to be also, or their purported obsolescence needs to be viewed from that lens. I mean, they're being used, and the counter question is, you know, would Ukraine be unfolding or have unfolded differently were it not for nuclear weapons? And I think the answer is a resounding yes. You know, history would be different. I mean, I think that so that, going back to possession and going back to you know, detonation, is but one way in which they can be misused and abused. So yeah, thank you.
The panel?